morning. Good morning.
Well, I just wanted to spend a quick second to introduce your keynote speaker, Israel Gott, the Agile executive. I'm very pleased to have him back. Last year, we had a scheduling conflict. He came the first year and helped support the conference. He's made some advances outside of just even technical debt and wants to talk to you today about Agile 2.0. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Israel Gott.
Thank you, Bart. And I guess a conference in which the organizers, till the last minute, struggle with the flow of the audience into the rooms is a very good conference indeed. So thank you. What I would like to explore together with everyone here today is where Agile is going. And my contention is that in the coming few years, all of us will be practicing Agile in quite a different manner than we have done over the past 10, 11 years. If you step back for a minute and you look at a software process.
Sir, can you turn that up a little bit? I think some folks are having a hard time hearing you.
This is about the best that I can do with this device. I can try to switch to that one.
Yeah, I think we need to.
Okay. Sorry.
Let's get to this one. I think we're going to need something a little bit more. Hello?
Oomph.
Yeah, a little bit more. Oh. Keep that one on. That one stays.
Yep. This one goes.
Right there. See if people can hear you better now.
How is it now? Is it better? Yes. Oh, great. Thank you. Sorry for the logistical adjustment at the beginning. So, going back to the business of the software process, I would say a process is always a product of its era. You have some needs, you have some constraints, you have some technologies which are available or unavailable to you at a certain point in time. And the process is conceived in order to respond to those needs. So my view of processes in general and software processes in particular is that they are alive, they evolve. An era finishes and we move into another era. And the kind of processes that fit it are most of the time different from those that were appropriate for the previous era. If you accept this premise, I apologize for the thing not being as clear. I will try then to speak to them on the squares here. If you accept this premise about the Agile process changing, then I would like to spend time with you on 5 items today. The first item is the context within which your company operates. I know nothing about the companies of most of you, but I would suggest that no matter what kind of business you are all or we are all subject to a similar set of changes. With that, we would move on to 3 practices that are becoming more and more important in Agile. And if you apply those practices, or will apply those practices, you need to ask yourself, what does it mean to the Scrum process, or any Agile process you use? And equally importantly, what does it mean to the way you are planning in your operation? As you can think about the planning and the Agile processes as being twin brothers. And last but not least, I will go together with you toward some new landscape of Agile, which I believe would be quite different from the way we have been practicing Agile so far. Now, starting with your own company, I would say in the past, we used to break companies by vertical segmentation. So you would have manufacturing and aerospace and government and retail, etc. And while those taxonomies still hold, what we see more and more is that the overall context of any company and of every organization is pretty much characterized by three forces. The first force on the right-hand side here is the business of the markets that you are serving. In the good old days, markets were broadcast to. You can buy this car, Mr. Customer, in any color as long as it's black. Now, about 20 years ago or so, with the Clutterine Manifesto, our notion of markets has evolved to the point that we started a dialogue with the participants in the market, and it became not a one-way communication, but more of a conversation. What we see more and more these days is that much more important than whom I converse with is what I do. For example, I download my boarding pass into my iPhone, and all of a sudden I become an interesting target to companies who broadcast sightseeing in Columbus and restaurants in Columbus and do this and do that, etc. And I would actually claim that the 800 or so folks here in this conference today, we constitute a market. The market constitutes for a day or two. It is formed by virtue of the fact that we all came here to the same conference and have mutual interests. And the job of marketing today is to a great extent to be able to latch into markets of this kind. So markets have moved on from being something that you broadcast to conversations, and now to actions. It's sort of a variant of don't do as I say, do as I do. My actions indicate who am I in terms of marketing much more than my conversations. Now, the value chains go likewise through a very dramatic transformation. In the past, value chains were A to B, B to C, C to D. And what we focused on was on the flow within the value chain, preferably on the flow of value within the value chain. So if I were a manufacturer, I would produce a car or something like that, and it would move on to the next link, which is the dealer. The dealer would add some services for the client, and ultimately the car will be sold. What we see instead today is value webs, namely I am connected, not in a linear manner, but in a dynamic manner, to a whole set of partners who, together with me, reach the market. I do not know in advance at any point in time to whom I am connected, in which way I would be connected, and most important, I do not know how value would be realized. If you go back to the example of the car, when the car leaves the factory, then we can put a value on it. There are enough accounting rules for us to say the car at this point in time is worth $15,000, and once it reaches the hand of the customer, it's $20,000. So traditional manufacturing, the value creation was pretty close to the value realization. What is happening these days is that in many products, particularly software products, the fact that I have produced a product does not to itself create any value. You cannot put a value on my application until the point in time in which it's actually being exercised by somebody in the value chain to generate specific value. To give you an example, assume for a minute that I'm in the business of photo sharing and photo dissemination. So I have a bunch of photos on my photo sharing site, and I would like to create an album of photos for my son's graduation or something like that. Of course, I am pretty familiar with my photos and this and that, But it might be that the thing that will make it create an album would be the fact that a certain template, which I have taken from some other parent who has posted it on the website, is the thing that will lead to the value realization. Namely, I will take all of my photos, put them in the album format that this other person defined, and only then it would be sufficiently of interest to me to pull the trigger of produce 100 albums of that. So what happens, the value realization becomes a much more fuzzy element than it used to be when we had specific concrete things in our hands, like a car. Third, but not the least, is a business of intersection of technologies. If you take a look at the cycle here, my apology. If you take a look at things here, technology used to be quite distinct. We used to speak about mobile technology, about cloud technology, about social technology or applications, and relate to each one of them as an independent technology. The fact of the matter that we are seeing the convergence of all those three and other technologies like data as a service. And the convergence of the technology leads to a very different playing field, a playing field in which the technologies to themselves are less important than the business design that you construct around them. And if I may speak for all of us here, we all grew in an era of immense amount of software being done. If you go to Andersen's quip that the software is eating the world, this is characteristic of the way we all evolved together with software. What we are starting to see, and I shall elaborate on it in a little while, is that actually things are changing, that due to the convergence of those technologies and some others, the way we do things today is starting to be different than doing them through software. So I don't care what company you work for, what industry you are in, I would say universally, you are subject to those three changes in the market, in the value chain, and last but not the least, in the intersection of technologies. Let me elaborate now on each one of those. The first one is about the markets. And markets today are no doubt global. However, global as they might be, they are hyper-segmented. And the way I would like to illustrate it is by way of this diagram here, which is taken from the work of Carlota Perez. Now, what you see here on the left side is a basic cell phone, which is not too interesting. I can use it to call somebody, etc. Now, if I download a certain set of applications, then it becomes personalized. It's my set of applications on my cell phone, which are quite different, possibly from your set of applications. And more than that, my set of applications today could be dramatically different from my set of applications a day, a week, or a month from now. Because those applications come all the time, produce new opportunities for me, and therefore my own cell phone changes as I download applications. Now, on the other axis, if you look here, you have the business of differentiated phones. So for example, the iPhone that I think many of us might be using is an example of a differentiated phone. It gives you much more functionality than the traditional cell phone that we used to use, and it gives it to you built in. Finally, if you load your own applications into an iPhone, you get a very specialized device, a device which is both differentiated by way of the applications that were pre-built into it, and is further customized by the applications that you or me or somebody else downloaded into it. So the net result of that is that we have here not only 4 kinds of products instead of a single kind of product, but that every one of those squares that you see along the way could be a potential market. So what happens, the differentiation in the market is much more granular than what we used to be. And to make things even more complicated, the differentiation is such that it is transient. The markets are being formed and being reformed and disappear in lightning speed. If you go back to the example of all of us here as being a market for a day or a 2 or 3, the fact of the matter is a marketeer who wants to get hold of us has got to do it today or at the latest point in time tomorrow. After that, we all go on our own ways, and offerings, let's say in Columbus, are not of interest anymore to somebody who moved back to Cleveland or San Diego or wherever one might live. So what happens is that the business of latching onto markets becomes a little bit of a real-time thing. And if you accept this premise that it is a real-time, this is not something that you can know about in advance. Namely, by way of the formation of markets for a very short period of time, your ongoing after those markets is something that needs itself to be done in real time. For example, I put something on the board of Pinterest and shared it with a set of friends of mine. This is de facto a market that you might be interested in and go after. Now, we talked about markets before, moving from being something I broadcast to into something that is now defined by actions. And what happened, if the market are defined by actions, the vendors who market to us have got to, on an ongoing basis, to do customer discovery and then customer development in the sense that Eric Ries and Steve Blank has advocated for some years now, because the natures of the market is that they are fleeting, that you have got to discover them and rediscover them and then develop them. And if you accept this view of the market, or if you operate in a market where those dynamics prevail, this, as we will see in a minute, means a lot of things to your agile process. Now, moving on to the business of the value chains, I already mentioned that the value chains are becoming more and more of value webs. And within value webs, we see primarily one kind of participants which are of tremendous value, and those are the so-called prosumers, folks who are both producer and consumer. If you go, for example, to my example a little earlier of a photo sharing site and myself wanting to create a yearbook or a graduation book for my son, I am of interest as a participant in a value web because the way by which I would design and offer template or templates of my album is of interest and of value to other folks who are on this photo sharing web. So what happens, those folks who on the one hand do their own stuff, and on the other hand offer it to other folks for using, become the most influential folks within the value web. And those are the folks that your company needs to cultivate and to invest in and to help do business any way you can, because they are the amplifiers of your going to market. The balance, therefore, between the traditional vendor and the folks who are involved in dealing with this vendor is changing in a dramatic manner. And in certain cases, like the company that you see here, the company actually let its clients, customers, prosumers choose its brand. Namely, the company did not determine the brand in the marketing committee or in the board or in any one of a kind of institutes that typically exist for this purpose, but rather used a poll in order to determine what would be the most appropriate brand for the company. If you think about what it means, particularly in the context of Agile, there is a very, very different division of responsibilities and division of how much one can do, because you can't really think about General Motors or General Electric coming to their clients and saying, gee, what should be our brand? This is not the kind of degree of freedom that traditional vendors provide. Where we are heading, we are seeing much more and more, namely me as a vendor and you as my prosumers sharing more and more in terms of what and how things are being done. Last one, the business of the converging technologies. And I will point out two convergences that are of particular interest to Agilists. The one is between the cloud and social. And the interesting thing here is that the cloud enables us to do everything as a service. So what happens once you accept the premise that everything is a service, the good old way by which we delivered software is being transformed big time. So software is not anymore release 3.7 that I sell to my customer. Software becomes instead a set of services that I provide to my customers. And to point out just to one subtle differentiation, of course I can provide service by way of software. However, when my model of interaction with my customers is about services as distinct from software, it's quite a different way in terms of how I develop the software and certainly how I deploy the software. Now, the other thing that we see, which I alluded to a little earlier, is that we are seeing an environment where services are being assembled together and brokered without giving any real attention to programming. Namely, certain atomic services are being provided by software. Those services, however, can more and more be combined together and sold to each one of us without using programming. And more we see folks in social networks following this kind of pattern. Namely, somebody else actually does the software, implements the service, and what our value add is doing the services, the compound services, without needing to do programming. So between cloud and social, the balance in terms of how much software we do or choose not to do is starting to change. The other linkage that I would like to point to is the one between the so-called social immune system and mobile devices. What do I mean by the social immune system? Of course, we test the software and to the best of our ability, try to make certain that it's very, very rigorous and very, very clean before we deliver it. However, more and more companies go about delivering to 0.01% of their client base. If the software shows promise, they deliver it to 1% of their client base. Then they deliver it to 10%, 50%, etc. So what happens, the software starts being viral. Namely, we deploy it to 0.01% of our customers and see what the reaction is. If the reaction is not good, we withdraw the software and it does not get into the system anymore. If the reaction is positive in one way or another, then we continue to propagate it through our customer base. So we start, instead of, or in addition to doing traditional testing, we start to be pushing things towards will it work or will it not work, and by way of differentiating our client base to very granular elements, we are able to treat the deployment of the software like an immune system, rather than the software is right, the software is wrong. Moreover, we are all used to the business of the super fresh web. The fact that we all have mobile devices enables us at any point in time to read the latest news or post the latest anecdote. The data is really outdated in a super fast manner. What we are seeing happening these days is that programming is becoming super fresh, just like content. Namely, I can deploy one feature this morning, get the data in terms of my customer response in the afternoon, and by tomorrow morning, we change things for the team to go in accord with the feedback, the real customer feedback, instead of guessing this story is the right story or that story is the right story or change the priorities without any customer feedback. So what happens is that super fresh, both in terms of content and in terms of programming, in terms of software, means a very, very different paradigm of developing and deploying the software. Because if my competitor can deploy the software between today and tomorrow based on real customer data, while I work on stories which had been defined in the release planning 3 sprints before, this is a major competitive disadvantage. So what happens is the combination of those technologies enable us to do things in quite a different manner, and furthermore, to more and more reach success, not by way of one technology versus another, but by way of what is the overall business design that we use to utilize them. Now, there are 3 practices that we are seeing being more and more used in the best and the brightest of our clients. And the first one is this of continuous grooming. The picture that you see here is a traditional picture of the backlog, nothing special to it. However, if you take a look at typical Scrum cycle, typically we would really revise the backlog between the demo, let's say on Friday afternoon, and the beginning of the next sprint on the Monday after. What we see instead in companies that operate on continuous deployment fashion, namely, I deploy the software now, I deploy another piece of software in 15 minutes, another one in the afternoon, another one in the evening, the feedback that we all get as a result of that is such that it enables us to go to the backlog and make the changes there in real time. So what happens, instead of a fairly static backlog, where we had this iteration, the next iteration, the one after, etc., we are seeing much bigger jumps in terms of the makeup and the priorities in the backlog. And those much bigger jumps are primarily reflection of the fact that instead of guessing what we need to do, we are able to operate in the mode of develop, deploy, take the feedback, and revise things within 24 hours, 48 hours max. So if you think about the role of product owner in typical Scrum environment, this is a tremendous difference. Namely, as a product owner, I worked hard on the backlog before the release planning. I did my very best together with my teams to refine it during the release planning. And then from sprint to sprint, we would make some changes. What we see between the best and the brightest is that they are doing less and less of this kind of pre-planned grooming, and instead a much bigger piece of grooming is being done on a continuous basis. So in many ways, the traditional guide rails that we used to have, namely I have an iteration of 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 week, and here are the rules how I dance around it, those become less and less important because things are becoming continuous. So one thing, the continuous grooming. The other thing is that the cadence of development is getting decoupled from the cadence of deployment. Think about what we were talking about a little earlier. I deploy a feature or some other thing this morning, then I deploy another one in half an hour after, yet another one in the afternoon, etc. What does it practically mean? It means that the buckets that we used to put thingies, namely the software is done at the end of 2 weeks or whatever the period is, are not really meaningful anymore. Namely, those were very, very meaningful when we coupled the deployment with the development. So the team would work for 2 weeks to develop the software, and towards the end of the 2 weeks, we would be in a position to deploy it if we chose to. Instead, we have now a hybrid model where the software could still be developed, let's say, every 2 weeks or so, but the deployment can be done really at any point in time. So if I'm a product owner in such a shop, and let's say today is Thursday morning, and a certain story is really done, and I think that my client base is dying to have it, there is absolutely no reason for me not to deploy it. What this means is that you can still use the sprints, the release, etc., to plan your software development, but in terms of deployment, the actual deployment can and is being done at any point in time that is appropriate. And this, to me, is a major departure from something that we had as software really from day one, and I'm talking before Agile, Waterfall, and anything else. We used to have releases, or today, if you want, code increments. And we would force the whole organization, marketing and customer support and professional services and sales, etc., to dance to this cadence. If the release was every 18 months, we would have the rest of the organization work in 18 months interval or around those intervals. If the release is every 3 months, the rest of the organization would operate in such a manner. Once you have continuous deployment, what happens is the business of how I develop the software become much less important because the deployment is decoupled from the development. So this is a major, major difference that we are seeing in terms of how software is being done. Last but not the least, the business of the shared backlog. And this goes back to the value web that we talked about. What we see time and time again is that somebody in the value web creates much more value than patient zero or company zero at the beginning of the value web. If you go back to the business of sharing photo and producing albums, somebody, let's say user, might have produced much more value than certain product or certain feature that the photo sharing company provided. As a matter of fact, many of those companies go more and more into curating templates for albums, cards, etc., because tremendous amount of value is in curating the right kind of templates that other folks can choose. And the curation is done by way of taking good templates from every one of us. And whether something will click for me as a customer in terms of producing an album or not is oftentimes not a matter of how my photos are stored or how they put together, but rather whether I can find a beautiful album which really reflects what I want to accomplish. So what the phenomenon of value generation in this manner means is that folks who have a lot of value add by way of a fancy template or a fancy process to produce it can command much more weight than was traditionally the case with various vendors. So if I were an active client of a certain company and I would express my needs, I need this, I need that, etc., the product owners would typically compile those needs, etc., and present them in the backlog. What we see these days is that this monolithic power of the product owner or of the company over its own backlog is getting eroded because active prosumers demand to be part of the process on an ongoing basis and to affect decisions on the backlog in ways that would reflect their own interest. And companies who are not responsive to doing it in such a manner oftentimes find themselves isolated without having good ways to reach the market. So 3 practices that we are seeing more and more at this point in time. The continuous grooming is one. The business of sharing with the various partners that we have in our value web is a second one. And together, they create a picture that is very, very different from the way you used to do software in the past decade and some more. Let me speak a little bit now about 3 aspects that are changing on us. And the 3 aspects are the artifacts, the roles, and the ceremonies of the software method. What you see in this table is a breakdown between the traditional way things were done and the way they are more and more being done today. If you take a look at the product backlog, it used to be my backlog, and it moves into shared backlog much more than it used to be. So it's not only a matter of the product owner having discussion with stakeholders and other folks about the composition of the backlog, it's the product owner needing to take into account the inputs of other folks in the value web. So major difference here, instead of product owner going to the backlog and sharing the priorities unilaterally between story A and story B, this power is now being shared. If you take a look at the sprint backlog, then in the past, it tied together design, development, and QA, sometimes other functions, architects, technical writers, etc. What happens with deployment being more and more of a continuous nature, it becomes something common to dev and IT operations. Namely, if you take a look at what the DevOps movement is leading into, it is basically, look, the design to the software, good that it might be to itself, is not good enough. You have got to be aware and take into consideration the deployment architecture. And the only way to take this into consideration in an effective manner is to bring in the folks from IT operations into the Scrum process or the Agile process or whichever way you use to do the software. So a major transition here in terms of who are the constituencies. We used pretty much to stay from design to test. At this point in time, if you really want to be effective with your software, you have got to have the IT operations folks as part of it. Last but not the least, we used to have the burn down chart, at least in Scrum, as a way to track progress and to do capacity analysis. If the team can do 50 story points in this sprint, probably in next sprint they would not do terribly different number of story points. So this was the traditional way that we looked at things. Now, if you take a look at a whole bunch of folks from other companies being really participating in the backlog and in what we do, then this traditional definition of velocity or capacity loses much of its value. And really the only thing that you can measure in a meaningful manner is cycle time. And these metrics that the Kanban movement has introduced in a very impressive manner over the past few years is becoming more and more common in just about any Agile shop. So what happens, you might still prefer to do Crystal or to do traditional XP or to do Scrum or any other software method. However, you will probably benefit from starting to measure cycle time as one of the atomic units of measure, one of the metrics that you use in your company. Now, let's go to the roles. The traditional product owner or the technical product owner was usually focused on the product. He or she spent 80% or some such amount of time on the product, would of course try to keep track of what's going on in the market with customers, etc. But ultimately, the product owner lives, so to speak, in the development team and works with them on an ongoing basis. So it is an inward focus. Now, if you take the premise that the markets are changing faster than I can say markets, and that the only way to find to whom we should market is to discover the customers and then develop them, then the thing that happens to the product owner is that his focus changes from the product to the business of discovering customer and then developing them. So we have a major transition here in terms of a product owner who spent 20% outbound and 80% inbound, starts oftentimes to spend his or her time in the opposite way. 80% outbound to find what's going on with the customers, 20% in terms of the product itself. So the product owner definitely changes. Now, the Scrum Master used to be the team orchestrator. And what happens these days is that he or she becomes much more immersed in the community of interest. Namely, the definition of this is my team or this is the other team, etc., is being more and more displaced by communities of interest. And the Scrum Masters float to the top, so to speak, of those communities of interest by way of their excellence and interest in certain area. So instead of having a Scrum Master for the team for 3 months or some such period, what we see that the people who facilitate the daily stand-up meetings are more and more the folks who have the keenest interest in a certain community of interests, and by virtue of this keen interest, they rise to the point that they understand the considerations probably better than everyone else, and as a result, they are much better in facilitating team meeting. In many ways, you can think about it as an open source model, namely the folks who are really deep into a software or into an open source project are precisely the same folks that or the kind of the same folks that we see rising up within the community of interests. And the same thing holds to a great degree to the self-organizing team. So it used to be my team. It turns out more and more to be community of interest. So we have for the next 2 or 3 or 4 weeks a community of interest in photo sharing in magazines, and the nature of the team is flexible. So for this period, it is about sharing picture in a magazine. The next one could be about books or any other things of that sort. What happens is we need still, of course, to maintain the quality of the software. And what we see is that more and more, the roles change in a way which is similar to that of the open source community. And we release the software after we reviewed it, etc., pretty much in the fashion that the committer status in open source enables us to do. So again, today is Thursday morning, and there is a feature that we want to release to the market. Remember, there are no releases anymore. There is just a feature that we are releasing. We will go and have the equivalent of the committer status person review the code, and if the code looks satisfactory, we will probably deploy it to 0.01% of our customers, etc. So the more static roles of product owners, Scrum Master, and self-organizing teams are becoming much more amorphic, much more dynamic, and it's not at all certain that you would have them for the duration of a release. It's actually more likely that you will see changes there in the course of the release. Now, what about the ceremonies in this kind of environment? Most companies that we work with do the stand-up meeting, no matter how much they are into continuous deployment, continuous grooming, or any one of the other features. So this traditional Scrum-type ceremony seems to be working effectively even in the new environment. Sprint planning used to be bi-weekly. And while this is certainly true that you can do a lot in terms of dependency management, etc., by way of sprint planning, we see the continuous grooming replacing it more and more. So yes, the sprint has some value in putting the frame around what we are trying to do, and folks still do it, but folks expect and sometimes demand much more change on a continuous basis. Last but not the least, the demo has its value in quite a few ways, like stakeholders' feedback, like galvanizing the team, like forcing the done, like leading to the retrospective. But if you think about it, if I deploy at any point in time that I desire, what really is the value left in doing bi-weekly demos? I can simply go to my website this afternoon and have a real-life demo of the things that I might be seeing in 2 weeks in the team demo. So what happened, demos become real-time and are much less relevant than what they used to be in the past. Okay, what are the implications for your processes? What you see here is a fairly traditional Scrum process. So we have the steady state of Scrum here in the circle in the middle. We have the preparatory period just before. Namely, we will do the business case, we will find resources, find funding, we will do initial backlog, etc. And ultimately, we will be doing the release. Now, what we are really doing by way of the traditional Scrum process is really getting dev and test to operate in a tight feedback loop manner. Namely, there are really two strands in the way we are doing Scrum. And allow me to put design aside for a minute. There is development and there is test. And what we do is we pull these two together in the way that those two arrows indicate, so that testing can start before development is done, and development benefits from the feedback of the testing in real time. So in a way, the whole premise of what we do in Agile, Scrum, etc., is start the test before development is complete and use the feedback from test to improve development. Now, think about it in a broader company context, namely in the context that put together strategy and delivery. You know what? Oftentimes, I don't know, or my clients do not know, or we both don't know, what is the appropriate strategy in a certain aspect that the company is working on. And of course, we do market analysis and technology trends and this and that, but we still do not know. I would contend that in those situations, and they are becoming more and more frequent these days, you can use the Scrum recipe of putting dev and test together with respect to strategy and delivery. So what happens, I start the delivery of whatever thrust I have before I fully develop the strategy. And the advantage of it is that I can start testing the strategy in the market sooner than I would otherwise be, and that I have the delivery, the results of it, feeding into the strategy in a way that would not happen otherwise, and which enables me to improve the strategy. So the same principle that enables us to put dev and test together and benefit from it applies to strategy and delivery. We start the delivery before we completed the strategy, and we provide feedback to bigger and better strategy by way of delivery. Now, think about problem and solutions. There are problems that are very ill-defined to any one of us, even these days. For example, if you take a look at what is the definition of cloud computing, it has evolved over the past 7, 8, 9 years in a way that clearly indicates that our definition of cloud computing some 5 years ago or so left much to be desired. And what happened is that little by little, we were able to better understand the definition of the problem and to tailor the right solutions for it by way of trying it time and time again in the market and learning from what happens in the market. So the same principle that we talked about, putting dev and test together, applies at problem and solution together. Namely, we have a problem of one kind or another that we are wrestling with. We don't really know what is the right answer to it. We will not find it by scratching our head in our cubicles. The only way to do it is to have the guts, and it oftentimes takes a lot of guts to admit I don't really understand the problem or don't really understand the major dimensions of the problem, etc. To start doing the solution, understanding that the doing of the solution will provide the feedback which will enable us over time to reach the point of better problem definition. And a quote that I would like to share with you is from Russ Daniels, the CTO of HP Enterprise Services, which is a current name of what used to be EDS. And Russ is quite an accomplished individual. He was one of the founders of Apple and has a track record which second to none. And still he has the humility of stating loud and clear in those words here about his limits, our limits, to be able to solve things in advance, and about the paramount need, and we are talking about the paramount need in the corporate level to iterate on things instead of pretend that we have the strategy or we have the problem solved in advance and then bump hard into the market. So the same principle that is so very true in development and test and design in traditional Scrum processes is now becoming more and more relevant and more important at the end-to-end level. Namely, agility is not merely how I do the software. Agility becomes a critical element of how the company needs to operate in order to respond to ongoing change. So this is something that gets into a lot of pushbacks because marketing says they can't work in this manner and IT says we can't work in this manner. Customer support says, of course, we can't work in this manner. But in terms of a trend which satisfies the needs of the market, this is something that we are seeing done more and more and providing more and more of a competitive advantages to those who become good at it. Now, let me conclude with a new landscape. And the new landscape goes beyond software. It goes into the business of how we do things. And if you take a look at the past 30, 40, 50 years, we did a lot of things by way of software. So 5 of us, or 50 of us, or 500 of us got together and produced an application of one kind or another. And this is the way things were being done. We are starting to see, while there is, of course, tremendous rise in the number of applications, because everyone and his grandmother is doing mobile applications in pretty much infinite amounts. While this is certainly a strong trend, we are starting to see that more and more people are doing things without reverting to software. And let me give you the following example. Some of you might have come here to Columbus using the good services of Expedia. If you think about it, what Expedia does, it gives each of us a bunch of services which are related to travel, business travel, leisure, etc. And those services are hard-coded. Namely, I cannot go, best I know, into Expedia and say, well, you know, I want the evaluations of my presentation in this conference to be posted to my Expedia. This does not exist there. This is a service that is provided by the organizers of this conference, but there is no way, at least that I know of, to bridge between the two. Expedia is hard-coded, it's about travel. The conference, for good and valid reasons, is about what's happening in the conference. And putting the two together is not something simple to do. Namely, I do it by my fingers and my eyes. I make my hotel reservation and flight reservation on Expedia, and then later on, I read my evaluation on the conference website. Now, think about the power if we could soft code such services to put them together. Because if you forget about the fact that there is software underneath, the buying of a ticket, airline ticket, happens to be done through software these days, but hey, we bought tickets before there was any software. And hotels existed hundreds, maybe thousands of years, much before software. And of course, any normal person speaking with an audience is very, very interested in knowing, did I deliver the message successfully, what I did well, what I did not do well, etc. And there are all kinds of survey software for this purpose, but one can get feedback in any one of a number of ways. And the point that I'm trying to lead towards is that while services had been and probably would be done for many years through software, we are reaching the point in which various services can be combined together and sold without doing a significant amount of software and oftentimes without software at all. And we call the companies, the class of companies that are starting to do it, do-by-web companies. And what do do-by-web companies or do-by-web platforms provide us? A, they enable us to link and aggregate the data on the web. Because the way I link and aggregate the data right now is, again, my fingers and my eyes. I click on the mouse, and then I make another click, and I pull the data and put it somewhere, etc. Do-by-web type platforms enable you to do it and to do it automatically. So they do the walking, if you please, across the web instead of we in person. Second, they enable automation of things. For example, they would tie together the weather forecast here to my trip plans. And let's say if it were the middle of winter and a fair amount of snow would be on the ground, the kind of car that I would rent from Hertz or Avis or whoever would be a four-wheel drive. And this is without me thinking about it and saying, oh my gosh, I might be stuck because of the snow. This is a service that is provided through the platform. Finally, the ability for all of us to write various prescriptions, if you please, to what we want to do on the web and make them available to anyone else in the community. If you please, it's not very, very different from the business of the album of photos that we talked about before. The album is the artifact that I create. However, various folks can provide the prescription to this is the way you develop a good platform and enable me or enable you to use it without any programming. So what happens, various tasks that for years we have been used to doing through programming or at least through scripting are becoming more and more available without the need to program. And the example that you see here is a forthcoming website, which you can think about as an Amazon-type website, where you can find and buy things pretty much in Amazon-type style. And this is done without any programming. This is done by way of one of those do-by-web platforms. So what happens when the delivery model changes from you buy or license my software release 2.5 into here is a service that you can use, various folks can package it together and offer it without really being in the business of software. So if the traditional wisdom for the past 50 years or so was that any company is really a software company, we are starting to see the opposite of it, namely certain things you can do these days without reverting to programming. And where it leads us is into two tiers by which we do things. There is, of course, the traditional tiers, which is we have data and analytics and insights, and we do grooming of the backlog, and we produce the software and give it to the service developer. This, no doubt, will continue big time. At the same time, what we see happening is a layer on top of this layer, which is about do by web without programming. So what happens, we are at a juncture in which it's not at all clear that the majority of what we are doing will continue to be done through software. To give you one example from something that I read yesterday, I think it was a CIO of the CIA who said that malware, every month more malware is produced than software, legitimate software, in a year. So even now, the proportions between the software that we all love and do and the proportion of software that is sort of done in a very, very different manner to other purposes is such that his estimate is a 12-to-1 ratio between legitimate software and malware. What we see here is, again, change in the proportions of software because various things has reached the level of maturity through our software work that they can be tied together and offered for sale without additional amount of programming. So what we are seeing, as I mentioned, are two curves. And I, for one, really do not know which one would be the bigger curve. One curve is tremendous amount of software being done. It's being done different than SAP or Oracle were being done, but still it's tremendous amount of software done for any device, anywhere, anytime. On the other hand, we are starting to see that services are provided without much software, and in certain cases, without any software at all. So I honestly do not know where it would lead, which one of those two, let's say in 2015, would be stronger than the other. This is one of the questions that really fascinate me, and right now I do not have a good answer for it. But what I think we can all expect is that we will be traversing a journey like the one that you see here. So you might start with continuous development and move into continuous integration and maybe continuous inspection and so on and so forth. However, the ultimate point in a journey, at least for some, could be composite services where no coding is required. So what happens up to this point, the business of how I code, how I develop the software, and how I tie it to the rest of my business was of a paramount importance. And we might be seeing a point of singularity in terms of moving from heavily software-dependent services into the kind of services where this will not be required anymore. Now, what does it mean in terms of how your company needs to operate? The basic phenomenon that we see is that change is constant. It's not anymore that we would have a period of change and then we would have a long time to assimilate it, to adjust to it, etc. Rather, change is constant. If you accept this premise, then in terms of competitive advantage, the only sustainable competitive advantage is that of learning. Because if change is constant, what I need to know, let alone what I need to do in 3 months from today or from 6 months from today, is very, very different, or could be very, very different from what I need to do now. So instead of competitive advantage being scale, or being scope, or being barriers to entry, or any one of the classical things, we see more and more that the whole thing is about learning. At a certain point in time, you turn the learnings into earnings. But up to the point that you have got enough learning, you have got to focus on the learning on an ongoing basis. And even when you transform the learnings into earnings, you have got to continue with the learning, or otherwise you start falling behind. So it's quite a different world than the one where we used to think about the software method as being something that the geeks do. We are now, I would contend, at the entrance to a world in which the whole company needs to operate in an agile manner. So it's at the level of development of test, which we have been done for 10 to 11 years. It's at the level of strategy and delivery, which we are starting to do. And more importantly, perhaps, it's at the level of the problem and the solution. In each one of those levels, you need to take the element on the right-hand side and start it before the element on the left-hand side was completed. And the advantages that you get are what we talked about. A, you get to start the right-hand side earlier, and you get the feedback to the left-hand side sooner. And this is basically the recipe for how we cope with change. Thank you very much.